Hello and welcome back to the STUDIOCANAL Presents podcast. My name is Simon Brew from Film Stories magazine, and this is a podcast celebrating one of the biggest and deepest film libraries in the world. STUDIOCANAL's extensive catalogue of films brings together cinema from around the globe, going back more than 100 years. The full library is over 6,000 titles strong and includes everything from modern favourites such as The Guard and Submarine, international classics including Pan's Labyrinth and Spirited Away, and sci-fi gems like The Fifth Element and Under the Skin. And we're going to do our very best to explore it all in this podcast. Every episode, I'm joined by a special guest for a deep dive into our film choice of the month. And along the way, we flag up new releases and re-releases, films you might have seen, films you might not have seen, but hopefully adding a movie or two to your watch list as we go. Across previous episodes, we've explored Apocalypse Now, The Railway Children and The Third Man. But now it's big blockbuster time, and that means we're digging into two of the biggest hits of Mr. Arnold Schwarzenegger. We'll be back after this clip from 1990's Total Recall.
What is it that is exactly the same about every single vacation you have ever taken?
I give up.
You're the same. No matter where you go, there you are. It's always the same old you. Let me suggest that you take a vacation from yourself. And I know, it sounds wild. It is the latest thing in travel. We call it the ego trip.
No, I'm not interested in that.
You're going to love this, Doug. We offer you a choice of alternate identities during your trip. Face it, why go to Mars as a tourist when you can go as a playboy or a famous jock or...
Secret agent. How much is that?
That is a clip from Paul Verhoeven's massively successful 1990 sci-fi favourite, Total Recall. And this is usually the bit in the podcast where I tell you we're about to go deep on a film. But this time round, we're actually exploring two classic Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, Total Recall and Terminator 2 Judgment Day. So if you haven't seen them, you might want to pause here and come back once you have. But don't worry, either way, we'll steer clear of major spoilers. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by my special guest for this episode, Nick de Semlyen. Nick is the editor of movie magazine Empire, as well as the author of Wild and Crazy Guys, How the Comedy Mavericks of the 80s Changed Hollywood Forever, and the upcoming book, The Last Action Heroes. And Nick tells me he's seen far too many Chuck Norris films. Is that actually a thing? Can you see too many Chuck Norris films?
I mean, arguably two Chuck Norris films is overdoing it. No, he's got some good stuff. I'm a Chuck fan, and I've got to spend some time with the great man. He's a very lovely man. But I have seen Chuck Norris in Forest Warrior, in which he can transform into different forest animals. And when you've seen Forest Warrior, you've seen too many Chuck Norris films.
4 stars, that sounds to me. Excellent. So, Nick, basically, we're about to talk about the two films that effectively made Arnold Schwarzenegger the biggest movie star in the world at the start of the 1990s. Can you just do a little bit of the road leading up to that and set the scene of what got him this far?
I mean, he was already doing pretty well for himself. He'd made like The Predator, the original Terminator, films which are iconic and classic now. He'd also conquered the world of comedy. He'd done Twins. He was really, really keen to become a comedy icon as well as an action one, and for people to appreciate that he was a funny guy, even though no one believed that he was going to pull it off. So he was doing fine as he was coming to the end of the 80s.
Yeah.
Then these two movies just took him to like some kind of crazy level.
Was Red Heat his comedy exploration? That was his straight man debut, really, wasn't it?
Cocaine. I saw Red Heat pretty recently. I don't know if it's dated that well. Yeah, that's the film that famously sort of starts with him fighting a guy in the snow, completely butt naked.
Yeah, I've done that.
We've all been there. It's got its moments. It's got its moments.
In Schwarzenegger's memoir, which is called Total Recall, he talked in that about building up his projects, about trying to get better paid each time. But I'd imagine even he couldn't necessarily see the scale of what Total Recall was going to become.
My terrible joke about his book is that it should have been called I'll Be Paperback. Should have done that.
Very good.
But Total Recall works as well, I guess. It was interesting. Total Recall, he was championing that one himself. Like Arnold really wanted to do it for a long time, and he was like doggedly hanging on to it. Originally, the rights were owned by Dino De Laurentiis, who's obviously this mega producer in Hollywood who Arnold had this massive beef with. They hated each other. Famously, they first met. Arnold walked into his office and said something like, "Oh, why is such a tiny man behind such a big desk?" And Dino De Laurentiis hated him and just basically didn't want him in any of his films. So Arnold managed to sort of wrangle the rights so that they went to Carolco, who he was friendly with, and that's how he kind of ended up in it. So I think he believed in it, but it did get pumped up to a ludicrous level. Like, it's a massive film.
Well, you mentioned Carolco there, and Carolco, of course, one of the, an independent film company like no other, competing on a level with the movie studios at rates they couldn't really afford at that stage. Carolco and Schwarzenegger and timing really seemed to be the touch paper.
Completely. Yeah, Carolco were these two guys, Mario Kassar and Andy Vajna, I think is how you say his name. And they started off just buying films, like these cheap films, and distributing them. And then they kind of got lucky with the first Rambo movie. But this was on another level for them. Like, this was a huge studio movie, huge sci-fi effects thing. So it was a big gamble for them.
I remember the summer that Total Recall came out, Die Hard 2 was in production as well.
Yeah.
And Die Hard 2 was said to be the film that could never make its money back. It cost $75 million to make. Total Recall was being financed by independent financiers, effectively, for $65 million. And that's the level that they were going toe-to-toe with them.
I'm pretty sure Total Recall, it was the most expensive film ever made at that point. I'm pretty sure there was a lot of pressure on it to perform. And it might not have. It's like an original, I mean, it was based on a Philip K. Dick short story, but I don't think there are enough Philip K. Dick fanatics for that to make it worth watching. So, Arnold had had huge hits, but he'd also had films that hadn't really made much impact. So going in, it was definitely a risk for everyone involved, including Arnold.
Come on.
I don't want to spoil it for you, Doug. But you rest assured, by the time the trip is over, you get the girl, kill the bad guys, and save the entire planet.
Total Recall had been around Hollywood for a little while as well. Infamously, David Cronenberg developed a version of it at one stage. Were there many other people who came by this project before it landed with Schwarzenegger?
There were. Bruce Beresford,
Driving Miss Daisy.
The guy behind Driving Miss Daisy actually was building sets and had cast Patrick Swayze for this role. And you're right, Cronenberg was involved. Like, apparently the mutants came from him, and he wanted to do mutant camels. I don't know. Part of me really wishes there was a version of this film with mutant camels. I mean, camels look a bit mutant anyway, but there's another podcast.
Is there a Chuck Norris film with mutant camels?
If there is, he definitely headbutts them. So, all through the 80s, people were trying to make Total Recall and failing miserably. It took a long time to come together.
When it did come together, for a big Hollywood production, its filming was nowhere near Hollywood. They went, was it to Mexico they went to shoot this one?
It was to a famous studio called Churubusco Studios, I think, in Mexico. The Patrick Swayze version was going to be filmed in Australia, but then they had to scrap all the sets. And so they went down to Mexico. And apparently it was a very tough shoot for all concerned. I think a lot of people got food poisoning. Arnold got mauled by a panther cub. Did you know this?
I didn't know, but I'm here for panther cub stories.
I heard this story from Arnold himself. I got to interview him, and I don't know how or why, but he told me the story of he went to George Foreman's house and had seen that George Foreman had a pet panther cub who he used to wrestle with. And Arnold got very jealous. He was like, the one thing I'm missing in my life is a panther cub. So when he was shooting Total Recall, they had a zoo in the studio, in these Mexican studios, and as luck would have it, they had a baby panther cub. And so Arnold used to take it to his trailer and wrestle it. Not even joking. And it was getting, the shoot was going on so long because it was such a protracted, difficult shoot that the cub was getting bigger and bigger. So he told me that one day this panther lunged at him and mauled him quite badly. So that was the day he took it back to the zoo.
One of the really interesting things I find about Total Recall is because it was done independently as well, it did eventually have to make its way through the Hollywood system. And there was an awful lot of problems, which Schwarzenegger's detailed, hasn't he, in the promotion of the film, that even 3-4 weeks away from the release of the movie, there was just practically no awareness of it.
Well, I think the main issue was the trailer.
Your mind. It is the center of your life. It is everything you hear, everything you see, everything you feel. It is everything you are.
There was
It wasn't good.
It's not good. I watched it again today, and it's quite strange and enigmatic and cerebral. Like the poster they went with in the end is kind of enigmatic as well, but in a cool way. It's like Arnold's face, and you've got this weird pyramid, and it's quite cryptic. I've seen the film many times, and I still don't understand what the pyramid is really, but it's quite elliptical and weird. But the trailer was like some art house kind of piece and mood piece, and it definitely doesn't look like the trailer for a film in which Arnold rips someone's arms out their sockets and does a one-liner.
How would you know if someone stole your mind?
Arnold was very into, at this point in his career, he was very into marketing. He was very into how you come up with a strategy to sell a film, and he did it on Last Action Hero as well, less successfully.
Yeah.
But in this case, he correctly said we need to redo the trailer and got in these guys, and they made a more fun trailer, let's say.
Welcome to Mars.
You got a lot of nerve showing your face around here.
Look who's talking.
The trailer at that stage in Hollywood in 1990, I mean, we didn't have websites, obviously, magazines and newspapers were promoting it, but the trailer was perhaps even more pivotal than ever.
Yeah, the trailer was huge. It was super important. I believe one of the guys who worked on the new Total Recall trailer also did the Robin Hood Prince of Thieves trailer and actually came up with the arrow point of view shot for the trailer, which they then put into the film.
The director, I'm sure you know this, the director of Jurassic World Dominion, Colin Trevorrow, nearly burnt his house down trying to recreate the arrow firing shot from Robin Hood Prince of Thieves.
I did not know that. I did know that he remade Die Hard with his cat, but I didn't know the arrow thing.
Come back when he's remade it with a panther cub, and then I'll be impressed. The release of the film then was a sensation in a summer where films, I mean, the summer of 1990 was notable for films that were expected to be massive hits not necessarily being so. I'm thinking Days of Thunder, the wonderful Gremlins 2, Dick Tracy, which underperformed. And yet Total Recall was one of the few big action blockbusters that held its own.
It was huge. I mean, it was another one. I mean, he was having multiple. I think, like I said, Twins was a huge, like, personal triumph for him because he was like, I'm a funny, I can make people laugh, and no one really believed in him, which is why he ended up with that crazy deal where he made so much money because he was getting a huge percentage because the studio were like, well, we're not sure. So he just had a huge moment, and then obviously he was about to have another huge moment with a certain sequel. But this was, it cemented him as just the action star. And Stallone, obviously, his bitter rival, was having a very bad time at the same time. So it was more salt into the wound of Stallone, the fact that Arnold was bouncing from triumph to triumph.
The story goes, doesn't it, that Stallone took Stop or My Mum Will Shoot because Arnold Schwarzenegger put out a rumour just to mess with Stallone's head that he was thinking of taking that film.
100% true.
Absolutely brilliant.
Sweetheart, be reasonable. After all, we're married.
Consider that a divorce.
So Schwarzenegger didn't waste an awful lot of time once Total Recall was done. He went straight off to make Kindergarten Cop, but also Terminator 2 came together. And the speed at which Terminator 2 came together after a long time talking about it was really quite something. I wonder if you can just take us into that.
Well, Cameron had the idea in his head. Actually, he was kind of waiting for the technology to catch up because he had the idea of having this liquid metal bad guy way back in the 80s. And so The Abyss kind of, it showed him that he could do the effects with the kind of watery, blobby stuff. That's the technical term at the end of that film. But also The Abyss just being a disaster and getting bad reviews and failing at the box office. So he kind of had to come back with something strong.
So The Abyss was James Cameron's 1989 film. I mean, would you say that had The Abyss gone off to be a huge hit, we would have waited longer for Terminator 2, or was this still going to be its moment?
It's really possible. It's really possible because I think Cameron was really galvanized by it. I think he had never had, not counting Piranha, the spawning, he'd never really had tasted defeat. And so this was a real stinger for him. So he did pull it together incredibly quickly.
And he's not a man known for pulling together films incredibly quickly, I would suggest.
He takes his time. He likes to take his time. But he apparently, he was writing Terminator 2 very fast, apparently occasionally taking ecstasy tablets to help him in that process.
I'm sure that'll get through the edit.
He talked about it on the record. But he pulled it together. It was famously announced with fireworks at Cannes, I think May 1990, and then The film came out July 1991. I mean,
Incredible.
that is insane.
When
And
you
Arnold,
consider what they were doing as well. And
the post-production, they wrapped in March 1991, and it came out in July, the beginning of July.
well, they'd learnt their lessons on trailers this time as well, hadn't they?
Yeah.
The story goes that Schwarzenegger came off the set of Kindergarten Cop to shoot a specific trailer for footage that wouldn't appear in the film. And that trailer, I remember watching that. That was a sensation.
I absolutely love that teaser trailer. It's incredible. The famous Terminator factory where you just see a Terminator being made, and it's not in the film. And I love trailers that are not in the film. It's just made just for the sake of being a trailer. It's so cool.
I'll be back.
And that's Carol Co. as well, isn't it? That's existing outside of the Hollywood system and having like the chutzpah to spend, $500,000 or something just on a trailer.
Yeah. I mean, there was a huge rights issue as well with Hemdale, and that's why it went on and on and on. So Carol Co. again kind of wrested the rights situation and saved the day. And you're right, this independent company made this gigantic movie. I mean, that is a gigantic movie. Feels bigger to me than Total Recall. Even though it doesn't go into space, it feels like just enormous still.
Get down.
You just touched before just on the groundbreaking liquid metal of Robert Patrick's T-1000 in Terminator 2. I mean, they used Adobe Photoshop, a version pre-Adobe Photoshop 1 to make Terminator 2. Can you just go into the groundbreaking nature of what they were putting on screen in such a short amount of time?
It still looks great, to be honest.
It's bizarre, isn't it?
It's so crazy. This film came out in 1991 and it still looks amazing. It hasn't
Why?
dated.
Why do you think that is?
I think because it's a really genius thing and had never been seen before, but it's actually quite simple. The idea of just a guy who's made of metal, and they do so many gags. So even though the effects have moved on and become much more sophisticated, just the level of the ingenuity and what they do with this guy and how they sell him. And some of the effects are quite lo-fi, in the Galleria mall shootout, Robert Patrick's got these little tinfoil things stuck onto him for bullet hits. So it wasn't all state-of-the-art CG, but they're so clever in how they blend the digital effects and the practical ones and everything. And just little moments like going through the bars and when he's thrown against a wall and flips around. I didn't describe that very well. Some of my favorite stuff is actually on the director's cut, on the kind of extended edition. They do some really cool extra stuff with the T-1000, but it's such a great, simple idea, and they get so much impact out of it.
You talked earlier about Total Recall being a very difficult shoot in very hot conditions, and I think in Paul Verhoeven, a director who's known occasionally to have a bit of a temper on him. James Cameron, in the absolute pressure cooker of making a film like Terminator 2, would you suggest that the making of that film, how do I set this up, was any softer?
No, it was infamous. It was kind of an infamous shoot for, well, let's just say he wanted very much for this to succeed, and he was going to make sure that happened, whatever it took. And it became quite famous. I think everyone in the crew got a T-shirt at the end that had all of his best one-liners on. So obviously, someone was every time he would scream at a crew member, someone would write down the line. It's online; you can find it. It's actually really funny. Some of the one-liners.
Do they involve just getting someone a nice cup of Horlicks and having a warm chat?
Not exactly. They're more screaming obscenities, but in very creative ways. Yeah, it was an intense shoot, and I think it took everyone to almost the breaking point. But an amazing film came out of it, and also an amazing Arnold performance, a performance that actually is really emotional and makes you cry at the end in some cases. A lot of people would cry.
Mom!
Come with me if you want to live.
So where are you on Arnold Schwarzenegger, the actor? Because there's a debate there. Barry Norman on the film programme on the BBC always described him as a human special effect. But actually, there's a degree of pathos to it. I mean, I'm not putting him up for an Oscar or anything like that here. But there's something a bit more in there, isn't there?
I think he's fantastic. I would argue his range is not incredible. It's there's a lot of roles you could drop him into and it wouldn't work well for anyone. But when a director knows how to play to his strengths, as James Cameron absolutely does, you get magic. And there's no one who does one-liners like Arnold. Think how many people have tried, how many action stars have tried to do the one-liners. But there's something about Arnold delivering a one-liner that is joyous.
I need your clothes, your boots, and your motorcycle.
He's the zinger master, and this is him in his prime. Like, there's so many great ones. Yeah, hasta la vista. I'm not going to try and do the accent. I will try and do the accent. Hasta la vista. And there's so many great bits. Again, if you watch the extended edition, there's a scene where the Terminator is attempting to learn how to smile, and it is delightful.
Is it as good as Wednesday Addams in Addams Family Values, trying to smile?
It's almost at that level.
See, that is a compliment and a half.
That's good. Maybe you could practice in front of a mirror or something.
What was the impact of this film when it landed?
I mean, people flipped out. People flipped out for Total Recall, but they really, really flipped out for T2. You know, the fact that you say T2 and no one thinks of Trainspotting 2. But there's a Rolling Stone article you can read where Arnold goes to a Terminator convention just before this film comes out and is in a ballroom full of people dressed like the Terminator, all of them screaming, and just chaos. But people really just embraced it. It's like it's still the ultimate action movie. And that last half an hour where it's just one long chase and they just keep changing vehicles. It's so fantastic. It's lightning in the bottle, this film.
I was in a cinema. I am old enough to have been in a cinema and seen it in 1991 with an absolutely packed out paying audience with Soap Dish playing in the screen next door, which was empty. They all went to see Terminator 2, and the atmosphere watching the film was quite something. I think I snuck in underage in my weak defence. I wouldn't endorse that.
I just saw Soap Dish 2 nights ago, and I wish I'd watched Terminator 2 again instead.
So, I mean, if you can just kind of capture then what happened next, because Arnold, this was the peak of his career, wasn't it? I mean, as much as True Lies came relatively close, this was what, Kindergarten Cop and the underrated Last Action Hero followed, but this was peak Arnold.
This is absolutely peak Arnold. Even Kindergarten Cop is iconic now. So you've got Twins and Kindergarten Cop, these two iconic comedies. I'm going to stick by that. And you've got Total Recall and Terminator 2 that are just absolutely peak. He's so cool in both those films. He's just iconic and amazing. Then he made Last Action Hero. Like, there's always has to be a downfall. And for Arnold, you know, while Stallone was kind of limping from one, he was trying to recreate what Arnold was doing with his comedy, and it was really not working. And while he was kind of faltering, Arnold, it just seemed like he couldn't put a step wrong. Then he made Last Action Hero, which has its defenders, including me to an extent. And you?
Yes, yeah.
I think it's partially successful. I'm not quite a, you know, there are people who say it's a masterpiece. I'm not one of those, but it's definitely got interesting stuff going on in it, and it's risky and interesting and meta and all that. So it's definitely worth watching. But for Arnold, he threw everything he had into that, all of his resources, and it didn't do well, and it really hurt him. It emotionally hurt him. And then James Cameron came and sort of bailed him out, and they did True Lies together, which was another hit. But you're right, this was the golden age. And after this, it's a bit of a decline.
And is Terminator 2 a masterpiece?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's probably my favourite action film. It's that or Jurassic Park. But I think it's pretty perfect. There's a little bit in Mexico. When they go to Mexico, that's when I go and make a cup of tea. But the rest of it, you just put it on, and it's if it's on TV, you have to watch it to the end. It's so great and so like machine tooled and just brilliant.
Hasta la vista, baby.
Before you go, Nick, what we like to do with all of our guests on this podcast is we ask them to dig into the STUDIOCANAL library and come up with a double bill for us. So I say this with trepidation, really. What have you picked?
Well, you're right to be trepidatious. No, I pored over this, I considered, I mused, and I've come up with a couple of westerns, but kind of offbeat westerns.
My trepidation level has dropped.
This is good news.
Excellent.
Well, my first one has got one of the all-time great scorpion scenes in cinema. It's Extreme Prejudice.
What's on your mind, Jack? I know you didn't come down here to tell me how good looking I still am.
I come over to talk about the bomb that went off yesterday. I got 2 people dead.
Yeah, well, you know, I heard that one fella got killed. Was unreliable, like to cheat his partners. Like to hold out on them.
This is a great film. I'm going to name drop slightly again, but I came across this film. I interviewed Robert Rodriguez a number of years ago, and he is a huge fan of this film, and it's kind of why he put one of the stars, Powers Booth, into the Sin City movie he did. It's essentially Nick Nolte versus Powers Booth.
Okay.
One of them is a lawman, the other one is a drug baron, and a cartel boss, and it's just a really great Walter Hill sort of neo-Western
Oh, You Had Me at Walter Hill.
Yeah, it's a lesser seen Walter Hill, but it's a really good one and really kind of hard-boiled and cool. And there's a great scene where Powers Booth picks up a scorpion and crushes it in his hand, as only the toughest drug boss can do. But it's a really, really good film and worth checking out. But a lot of people haven't seen it.
And what would you pair that one with?
I'm pairing it with Red Sun.
Okay.
Which I only discovered quite recently. I've been watching a lot of Charles Bronson films lately for no particular reason, and I'm regretting many of them. But this is one I really enjoyed. It's got a really cool hook. It's a Western in which Toshiro Mifune's samurai teams up with Charles Bronson's gunslinger. So it's kind of an East meets West thing. And they go on an adventure together and become friends and buddy up. And it's a really cool Western. Again, it's not seen that much, but I really, really liked it.
Where does it team up with the other East-West meet-up of James Belushi and Arnold Schwarzenegger in Red Heat?
Well,
can we make it a triple bill?
Let's tag on Red Heat just for that opening scene.
Excellent.
In the bathhouse, for sure.
Nick de Semlyen, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
So if you haven't seen them, or if hearing all of that made you want to dig out a leather jacket, stick some shades on and watch Total Recall or Terminator 2 again, then you can find them both on 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray and Blu-ray. What's more, if you head to the STUDIOCANAL Presents channel on Apple TV and Prime Video right now, you'll find another load of Stone Cold classics too, from The Elephant Man right through to Escape from New York. Now it's time for the regular section of the show where we share news from the world of STUDIOCANAL. And we're starting this time with some production news, because since our last episode, 2 new STUDIOCANAL projects have been filming, and I've got updates for you on both of them. Shooting in Scotland is the much anticipated screen adaptation of The Outrun. Based on Amy Liptrop's best-selling memoir, the film version's directed by Nora Fingscheid and has a stellar cast led by Papa Essiedu, Stephen Delane and Saoirse Ronan. Ronan stars in this one as a woman just out of rehab who returns home to the Orkney Islands after a decade away. And there, memories of her childhood are about to merge with more challenging recent events that her character's been facing. Liptrop co-wrote the screenplay to this with Fingscheid, and the film will be in cinemas in 2023. Also in cinemas in 2023 is Mother's Instinct, headlined by Jessica Chastain and Anne Hathaway. This one's wrapped filming now and is in post-production. The film marks the directorial debut of cinematographer Benoit Delhomme, who shot movies such as The Theory of Everything. And this one too is based on a book, in this case Derrière la Haine by Barbara Abel. 50 States of Fright scribe Sarah Conrad wrote the script, and the story follows 2 best friends and neighbours in the 1960s. Now Chastain and Hathaway play said neighbours who seem to be living an idyllic life until, well, let's just say a tragic accident shatters things. Josh Charles and Anders Danielsen Lee, who we saw in The Worst Person in the World earlier this year, are co-starring in the film. One quick thing I also want to flag here is that the subject of one of our earlier episodes, The Railway Children Return, is now available on premium video on demand, as well as still playing in cinemas across the country. And then on home formats, well, I definitely don't want to talk about 1986's Highlander just so I can make the obvious point that given the conceit of the much-loved film is there can be only one, well, they sure made a lot of them. But the original Highlander, starring Christopher Lambert and Sean Connery, is heading to 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray in a collector's edition on October the 31st. And that's going to give me plenty of time to do the same gag again in the next episode.
There can be only one.
And then I just want to finish with a little film story, because it would be remiss of me not to return to the star of this episode, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Now, a couple more Arnie adventures are available or about to be available on 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray disc in the UK. Red Sonja's just landed and Raw Deal is coming our way in October. But as it turns out, Raw Deal has an indirect link to Total Recall. So the checkered history of Total Recall saw it go through numerous hands before we got the version that we got. For a period of time, producer Dino De Laurentiis, the producer of Flash Gordon no less, was developing the film. And this was back in the early to mid-1980s, a time when Arnold Schwarzenegger's star was certainly on the up, but he wasn't yet fully established as a major box office draw. Now, on the flip side, Patrick Swayze was closer to that, and that's where De Laurentiis was focusing his attention. He wanted Swayze for Total Recall, but he didn't want to get on the wrong side of Arnold Schwarzenegger either, who would, seeing the potential in him and spotting a box office opportunity. So as Schwarzenegger thus writes in his memoir, he was, quote, not too pleased to not get Total Recall, but he explained Dino has a backup plan for him and offered him a different project, Raw Deal.
Losing improves your character.
Winning improves your wardrobe.
Schwarzenegger would then make Red Heat for huge Hollywood indie studio Carolco, and it had all mixed together a little down the line. Raw Deal and Red Heat helped make Schwarzenegger a bigger star. Carolco got the rights to Total Recall, prizing them away from De Laurentiis, and the rest is history. And you can enjoy the results of this little film story on 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray. Red Heat is available now, along with Red Sonja and Total Recall. Raw Deal arrives towards the end of October. And that's it for this episode of Studio Canal Presents. Next time, we're going all the way from Mars in the year 2084 to continental Europe in the 1960s as we dig into the French New Wave. In the meantime, to find out more about Studio Canal films and the Apple TV and Prime Video channel, you can visit www.studiocanal.co.uk or follow Studio Canal at Studio Canal UK on Twitter, Instagram and TikTok. As for me, I'm just, inspired by Total Recall, heading off for a trip to Mars myself now. I'll see you back here very soon for the next episode of Studio Canal Presents. If I could do a hasta la vista in an Arnie accent, rest assured I'd do it here. Instead, I'm just going to say ta-ta. Ta-ta.
Cocainum. 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 Cocainum.